Hey everyone, and welcome back. You know, history can sometimes feel less like a clear path and more like, a tangled mess of yarn.
Mm.
And today we're going to be untangling one of those knots, the idea of white identity.
Yeah, it's a term that can really spark a debate, and for good reason. But we're not shying away from it. Instead, we're diving headfirst into the deep end.
That's right, we are. We got sent these really interesting excerpts from an article called, get this, The Problem with White Identity. So we're going to try to unpack all of this, figure out why it even matters, especially these aren't things you usually think about too much.
Yeah, and just jumping right in, this article kind of throws you a curveball right away, like right off the bat. It says that this white identity, it's not just about what you see, skin color. It's like way more about how historically Europeans interacted with other cultures throughout, well, all of history.
So it's more than just surface level. There's all this history beneath it.
Exactly.
Like, I don't know, imagine a mosaic. You've got all these little pieces. Those are like the historical events, and they all come together to make a much bigger picture, even if it's not always super clear at first.
And, one of those pieces, like a really big piece of the mosaic we have to consider, is colonialism. I mean, it wasn't just about who was in control of what land. It was also about how specific groups, the ones who came out on top, they started connecting this idea of whiteness with, well, with being better than,
Yeah.
with having more power, more privilege. And that, unfortunately, has really stuck with us. You can see it even today.
It really makes you wonder how different cultures, even ones that all started from that European background, how they ended up so different because of their own, like, individual stories.
Hmm.
Like, American culture, it feels so different from, say, French culture or German culture, even though they all have those European roots somewhere way back when.
Absolutely. And it just goes to show that this white identity thing, it's not one size fits all. Even the article says, like, we shouldn't lump every European culture together like they're all thinking the same way, having the same worldview. That's like, I don't know, saying all music is the same just because it's sound. There's so much more to it.
So much nuance.
Right. Each culture, it has its own unique flavor, its own values, its own beliefs.
One part that really got me thinking was where it argues that we shouldn't just erase all those different cultures and ways of seeing the world within this broad category of whiteness. It's like that saying you hear sometimes, I don't see color, I just see people. But doesn't that kind of ignore how much someone's background, their heritage, how much that shapes who they are?
Right. It's coming from a good place, but it can accidentally dismiss those really important ways that our cultures make us who we are. And this isn't about saying one culture is better or worse. It's about recognizing that even within one group, people have a whole bunch of different beliefs, different values. It's this diversity within whiteness that makes it so complicated. And the author, he really digs into that.
Okay, so if whiteness is so complicated, then where do our loyalties ultimately lie? Like, who do we feel the strongest connection to? The article, it talks about these circles of loyalty that, like, they get bigger as they go out. You start with your family, then maybe it's your ethnicity or your nationality. Where do you draw the line?
That's a really fascinating way to think about it. It makes you question where we draw those boundaries, right? Like, who are we choosing to put first? Having that strong loyalty to a group, it can be great. It can make you feel like you belong, like you share something with others. But it can also turn into this us versus them kind of thing, and that can be dangerous. Navigating all of that in a world where we're all so connected, that's something the article is really concerned about.
It actually reminds me of something I saw in the news recently about insert relevant news story about cultural or national identity. Yeah, it really makes you think, right, how do we find that balance between all those different parts of who we are? Especially because it's not always so simple. Like the article even says there's kind of a paradox when it talks about shared interests. It's like, on the one hand, it says that recognizing this white identity could actually help Europeans like realize what they have in common, especially in today's world, with globalization and everything. But then on the other hand, how does that even work when whiteness itself is so incredibly diverse?
And that's really the heart of the issue, isn't it? It's like the article is saying, look, there are these common threads, right? These historical and cultural things that connect people within this whiteness category. And yeah, those things can totally influence how different groups interact with each other on a global scale. But, and this is a big but, those threads, they don't erase the fact that there are still all these cultural and individual differences within those groups.
It's like when you travel and it just kind of hits you.
Yeah.
I remember when I was in insert country, it was like, yeah, okay, there were obviously things that were different, like the language and the culture and all that.
Yeah.
But then I kept having these moments where I connected with people, just like basic human stuff that went beyond all those differences.
Exactly. Recognizing that shared humanity, that's so important. But the article, it wants us to go even further than that. It's not enough to just see what we have in common. It's about really appreciating all those differences too, all the things that make individuals and cultures unique, even within those larger groups.
And this is where the article gets really specific about North America. The author talks about how, for a lot of white Americans, those really distinct European ethnic identities, they've kind of gotten blurred over time. Like he uses the example of intermarriage, how that's led to this blending of different heritages.
It's the whole melting pot idea, right?
Right.
But even in a melting pot, you can still kind of taste the different flavors, can't you? They mix together, sure, but you don't lose them completely.
Yeah, they influence each other. He gives this one example that's really interesting. He talks about the Amish communities, how they've managed to keep their distinct culture, even their own way of speaking, while still being part of American society.
It's a great example of how you can hold on to your cultural heritage and still be part of something bigger. It shows that identity is fluid, you know? It's complex. You can feel strongly connected to your ethnic group and still embrace the values and traditions of your national culture at the same time.
But the author also seems a little unsure about this whole idea of distinct ethnic identities within whiteness kind of fading away. Like, he's worried that it might make people forget about the very real differences that still exist between different European cultures.
It's a good point, and it's worth talking about. It's not that we need to go back to being more divided. It's more that if we just lump everyone of European descent into this one big white category, we lose sight of how rich and complex those individual and cultural identities really are.
It's in those messy details, those little complexities, that you really get to have the good conversations. You know, it's easy to just see things in black and white, but this article really reminds you that identity, it's more like a spectrum.
Exactly. And the problem with white identity, it's encouraging us to be okay with that spectrum, to really lean into those nuances and to get that understanding. Whiteness isn't about placing blame or making assumptions. It's about having those open and honest conversations about history, about culture, about what it really means to be human, you know?
And this is where the article takes this really interesting turn. Like, it gets kind of personal. The author starts talking about how he wishes there was this, like, one clear European perspective.
Yeah.
But then he's like, but there's just not.
Yeah, it's like you can feel this yearning in his writing, this desire for everyone to just like get on the same page and have this shared identity, you know, to overcome all those differences in culture and history. But then he also kind of throws his hands up and is like, that's not how it works. That's not how humans are.
So like,
people are messy. Our experiences are messy, and things change all the time.
He even uses this example of, like, imagine having to pick sides, right? Say France or Germany. Who are you rooting for? Or, you know, to bring it to today's world, think about what's happening between Russia and Ukraine. It's so tough because you've got all this history, all these loyalties, and sometimes it feels impossible to know what's right.
It really highlights how difficult it can be to, like, navigate a world where everyone's got different goals, different grudges they're holding on to, different ways of seeing the world. And I think what the author's trying to say is that sometimes it's not about picking a side at all. It's about understanding that everyone's coming from their own place, their own experiences, and trying to see things from all those different angles.
So after going through all this dense and nuanced stuff, where do we even go from here? What are, like, the key takeaways from exploring this whole white identity idea?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about how this concept of white identity, it's like really tied up with how power has shifted throughout history, especially during colonialism. We saw how it's definitely not as simple as just lumping everyone together. There's so much diversity within whiteness itself. And then, of course, we talked about all the complications that come with loyalty, with belonging, with trying to figure out where you fit in a world where all these different identities are constantly bumping up against each other.
We also saw how this isn't just a European or North American thing either, right? These questions about identity, about belonging, about shared history, they're happening everywhere.
Absolutely. And I think that global perspective is a perfect jumping off point for our listeners. The article focused a lot on Europe and North America, but what about everywhere else? How do these ideas about identity, especially within groups that have historically held a lot of power, how do they play out in other cultures, other parts of the world? Are the challenges the same? Are they completely different? It's something to think about.
It really is. There's so much more to explore, so many more layers to uncover, not just about white identity, but about all these different facets of what make us who we are. But that's all the time we have for today.
Yeah.
We'll leave you to continue that deep dive on your own. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.